You actually had the opportunity to interview your father since he's been incarcerated and stuff. You learned an awful lot from him as well as your other studies. But there was one segment there where you were talking about where you were advising a couple churches, and then they turned around and started welcoming or having sympathy and empathy towards that individual more than they were the victims. Can you address a little bit of that? What you learned from that? What your disappointments?
Yeah, I mean, that actually happens more often than not. I would say in the vast majority of cases where there's a child sexual predator who's actually outed in a church, I would say, it's hard to get estimates because there aren't real studies, there aren't case studies behind this, but just in my experience, I would say over 90% of the time, churches are supportive of the abuser and not the victims. That really shocked me when I first started doing this. Now I just come to expect it. It was shocking because people looked at my mom and I as, as we were like these really rare gems that they just couldn't believe that I wouldn't I wouldn't first talk to my dad about it and try to get both sides of the story and they were shocked that we reported to the police and I said, "What other option was there?"
Right.
Like for me it was very confusing that wasn't the norm for churches, but I would come to find out that the majority of churches cover up abuse. Now, they won't call it a cover up. They'll call it things like grace and forgiveness and all deserve a second chance. They'll use language like that, but they circumvent even in states where it's so clear, crystal clear according to the law that they're mandated reporters. They'll still find ways to Christianize and standardize the language and say, well, all sin and fall short of the glory of God. So I think at the heart of the issue, it's a theological issue. It's really bad theology that causes really bad practices, and that includes
Amen.
denial, cover-ups, this rush to forgive the abuser, while not only ignoring the victims, but the more the victims cry out, the more the leadership gets really irritated with them, and they'll say things like, first of all, uh, you're slandering a good brother. They'll use terminology like that. You're slandering a perfectly good brother. And if you're wrong, you will ruin this person's reputation. And I always come back and I'm like, my goodness, what about the soul of that victim? You know,
They're
they,
saying this to the victim.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, they're saying to the victim, if you're wrong. I have a feeling they understand whether or not they're wrong.
Exactly right. Well, and it's buying into the myth that the majority of people who disclose abuse that it's false accusations. We have a case right here in Somerset. I don't know if you've heard about it, but our county sheriff is under investigation right now by our attorney general. And you wouldn't believe the people coming out of the woodwork who are just like, I know this person. I've known the sheriff my whole life. And what about innocent until proven guilty? And this is all a sham. There's another guy who I know. I went to Shanksville with him. He's calling the victim. He named the victim's mother and is calling her out by name, saying she's running a smear campaign against Somerset County Sheriff. That's currently going on. I mean, right now as we speak. That's typical in the churches. Those kinds of responses are very typical. Where the victims are doxxed, the victims and their families, that's why victims don't come forward.